Hey guys, we're going to talk about classification of organisms, and then you're going to do a homework with cladistics. So a phylogenetic tree is basically a way of showing relationships between organisms. You can see here that all of the eukaryotic organisms or protists, eukaryotic organisms started as protists, and then different branches evolved over time. And the longer two organisms stay together on a branch, the closer they are related in DNA and embryological development and other sorts of relationships. So phylogenetic trees are basically just used to try to figure out the true evolutionary relationship among organisms. There are three ways to classify organisms. The first is kind of old school or orthodox phonetic, and that is classification based on what an organism looks like. It basically puts the organisms that are most similar looking in the same group. The problem with this is that, for example, both whales and fish have fins, so they might be grouped together, but they actually don't share a very recent common ancestor. We could say the same about bats and birds. The next way to classify organisms is cladistics or phylogeny, and this is based on common ancestry, which is done very commonly. But the problem with this one is that there's sometimes unequal evolutionary rates, so that becomes difficult. And the third way is called evolutionary taxonomy, and that kind of solves the unequal evolutionary rate problem. But it does this by using phylogeny as far as possible, but then it make some adjustments to account for those unequal rates of evolution. So as we were saying, classification is just a way to show evolutionary relationships. The longer two organisms stay on a path together, the more closely related they are. And we can see this through evidence with DNA, embryological evidence, and also geologic fossil evidence. So phonetic or orthodox classification places organisms in groups based on Linnaean's classification system. So people might say, oh, well, all animals have hair, so they're classified as mammals. And that kind of works. But there's also organisms that look alike, but they aren't necessarily closely related. So there's a stellar jay and there's a blue jay, but they can't interbreed, so we wouldn't, even though they look alike, we can't put them together. So this system can be deceiving, and it's quite subjective. The phylogenetic species concept, again, is the idea that it shows the evolutionary history of a species, and it defines species as a cluster of organisms with evidence of a pattern of common ancestry and descent. When a cluster branches, it becomes two different species. So rat and mouse probably had a common ancestor, but then they separated over time, and now there's many different mouse species. And it helps place extinct species and onto the phylogenetic tree, and it also is able to incorporate molecular or DNA evidence. Clades are basically groups. A clade is a group that includes a common ancestor and all of its living descendants. So right here, this is a group of organisms that have a common descendant. That's also a clade. But right here, this is not a clade because it has two different common ancestors, and this also is not a clade because it misses this one. So it uses phylogeny, and it's pretty easy to tell if a group of lineages form a clade. Sometimes clades are nested within each other, and a clade may have thousands of species, like this bigger grouping here of the pink one, or it may just have a few, like this little yellow one. Cladograms are pretty cool. They use cladistics or clades, and it's a way of classifying organisms according to the order that they kind of diverge from a common ancestor, and it groups the species according to derived and ancestral characteristics. I like to think of this as a bus route, and right now on this bus you've got lamprey, shark, salamander, lizard, tiger, gorilla, and human, and as the bus keeps going, it reaches these stops and it says, oh, well, you can only stay on the bus if you have jaws. So guess who gets off the bus? Mr. Lamprey. Then you keep cruising along, and the next stop it says, you got to have lungs to stay on this bus. And the shark says, oh darn, I don't have lungs, and he gets off. Then the salamander gets to a point where he has to get off because he doesn't have an amniotic membrane. The lizard has to get off because it doesn't have hair, etc. And the longer you're on the bus together as species, the more closely you are related. So all mammals have fur or hair, but no other organisms do. Therefore, all mammals must have descended from a species that had no other living descendants. And mammals form a clade, or a branch, on this diagram of the history of animals. So you're going to make a cladogram virtually, and the first thing you do with a cladogram is you determine which of the characteristics each animal has. So here's a bunch of characteristics: having a backbone, having a placenta where live young are grown, and having your foramen magnum forward, which is a hole in the back of your head that allows you to stand upright. So we X off what characteristics each organism has. Horses have a placenta and a backbone. Humans have placenta, backbone, and foramen magnum. We total up the X's, and we draw a cladogram to illustrate the ancestry of these animals. And that diagram should reflect the shared characteristics as time proceeds. So you can see that tuna diverged away from a common ancestor longer ago than horses. But we also know that all of these animals are alive today, so they are even on the time scale. If one of them had gone extinct, it would not be there. I'm going to put a link to this video because I was having a little issue with that, and you can watch that if you want. Otherwise, you can move on to your homework. All right, thanks. Have a great night.